was thinking, there we go. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we are live. Another episode here of This Week in Drones. Should be going live here to YouTube and LinkedIn. Should be kicking on in a second. And folks out there that are tuning in as we're live, if you're here with us throughout, if you guys have questions for our special guests, feel free to send them in here as we go through it. And you got these panelists here available to answer the questions that you might have. Our topic today is protecting critical infrastructure, airspace, as drone delivery scales. And so anything related to that topic, as you guys are tuning in, feel free to kind of shoot us some questions. But I'll give you the quick rundown of what we're going to talk about, and then I'll pass it around for some introductions and get some updates from folks here on where they're at and kind of where the industry's at. But my kind of biggest questions, kind of the threads that I was going to ask these folks about today was going to be, number one, this big announcement that we've seen with Amazon scaling their drone delivery to, I believe it's over 500 cities, which is massive, huge. And Echodyne has been tracking that since 2014, since we started as a company. That was our first radar platform, was in collaboration with Amazon for their drone delivery. And then now we're in 2026. And finally, it's amazing to see Amazon now really kicking that off and scaling that. And then, Echodyne being here to partner. But it's just, it's kind of cool to look back in history to see that. But then we'll kind of go under the under the hood on that, or kind of down into the weeds on that, what it's going to take to see that happen. And then Sean, which I'll pass it to you here in a second for an introduction, but Sean is our guest here today, representing Energy, Drone, and Robotics Coalition. So in my head, that energy market where you have critical infrastructure and oil and gas and substations and all these energy related utilities and sites throughout the country. And then I'm thinking, well, if Amazon's going to be flying drones throughout the low altitude airspace in the thousands, across 500 cities, how is that going to impact, and how are those drones going to be, accounted for from the energy perspective? Like if I'm a substation, if I'm an LNG or oil and gas location, and now I have hundreds of these drones zipping around, flying overhead regularly, what does that look like? How do I know who they are? Or, is it a security issue? Or, kind of like, I'd love to just tease that out as we go through and just get your wisdom, your perspective, what you are hearing in the market. What, are people worried, or are they excited? I mean, like, where do we go from there? And last but not least, we'll touch on the fact that most of us here are going to the commercial UAV conference in Vegas coming up early September. I think it's the 2nd and 3rd or something like that, that we're doing the tabletop there. And, from Echodyne. And then Sean is going to be there as well, representing the Energy, Drone, and Robotics Coalition. And so then, we'll kind of get to that as well. But I thought I'd mention it to folks tuning in. If you're going to be there in Vegas, first week of September, come say hi, come to our booth, come say hi to Sean. And normally I would you'd be able to connect with Michelle there, I would think, in person, but she will be in Cancun at the time. Lucky. So otherwise, from there, Sean, I'd love for you to do an introduction, and and then I'll go to Michelle and Wes and Josh. But Sean, thanks for joining us. Thanks for putting the time to come kind of share your insights into the industry and what's going on. Would love to just kind of get a brief introduction for those tuning in that may not know who you are, and so they can learn a little bit about the coalition and the event that you host. And then we'll go to Michelle for intros, and then we'll kind of come back around to kick off the topic after that.
Sure. Really excited to be here with y'all. Thanks so much for having me today. So the Energy, Drone, and Robotics Coalition is a group of about 350 oil and gas, energy, power utility, chemical companies who own and operate assets globally, as well as the other key stakeholders, which would be obviously the service companies and the technology solution providers who basically help them to grow their drone and robotics, and from that data programs across North America primarily, but some of them have assets around the globe. And we're really working all the time to make sure they get best practices, use cases, and technology updates in order to continue to scale those programs in a safe and efficient manner.
Perfect. Awesome.
You bet.
Yeah, that's great. Yep. We'll come back around and we'll deeper dive, but thanks for joining us, Sean, and looking forward to your comments on some of these topics. Michelle, so good to see you. I would love to hear. Yeah, just give us share who you are, what you do, and then kind of how people can engage with you. Well,
sure. Well, first, it's really good to be back. It feels like homecoming for me. It's been a minute, and I apologize for that. I'm Michelle Duquette, 3 Mad Air Consulting, and I have been very, very busy since the beginning of this fiscal year, or this calendar year. So I've been traveling a lot and unable to join you. I think this is an important conversation to have, though. Throughout all of my travels, it is the energy discussion has matured over the last couple of years. We went from it's probably going to be important, to now becoming foundational infrastructure that is tied to other sectors. And there's a realization that we aren't, the drone community is not the only community in the universe, and we do have to share. We do have to figure out how to allocate smartly without costing the taxpayers or our service suppliers or our airports ridiculous costs, right? So I'm looking forward to having this conversation, hearing Sean's perspectives, and really getting into it.
Come on. Awesome. Thanks, Michelle. Wes,
yeah,
welcome
thanks,
to the
David.
Echodyne team as well as joining us here on This Week in Drones. And just for those listening who may not know that, you are now with us here at Echodyne. Feel free to share what you're doing.
Yeah,
here.
absolutely. Thanks for having me again. Happy to be here as well. And, I've joined Echodyne 3 months ago, and a big part of my work here is focused on the radar for the ground-based detect and avoid. So I'm the partner specialist for that. And, talking with partners, integrators, and users on how radar can play a role in enabling operations that scale into operations like drone delivery, public safety, critical infrastructure, and eventually, advanced air mobility. So we need that infrastructure in place, which gives operators reliable airspace awareness, and looking forward to being part of the conversation. And I think this will be my 10th, maybe 8th or 10th commercial UAV show. So happy to provide my best tips and tricks towards the end of the conversation here. Passing it back to you.
Nice. Awesome. Josh?
And Joshua, with Echodyne, doing business development in the West. Very happy to be here and part of this conversation. I think it's very timely. I've been in a lot of conversations with folks in the energy sector, also ports, and I know with a lot of the stuff happening in the Middle East, a lot of with FIFA just kind of wrapping up and now looking to the Olympics, a lot of these different organizations are starting to become more aware and educated around the risks of not knowing what's in your airspace, and also starting to look at some of the benefits. How can they leverage drones to do their business more effectively, whether that's currently with drone inspections, or even looking to the maybe distant future around heavy lift drones being used as part of their managing their supply chain and things like that. So a lot of really exciting things, both with obviously protecting sites, but also just a lot of amazing things that folks are doing to enable their business with drones. And I know that's something that Sean and your team have really been at the forefront of educating folks. So definitely very excited for this conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. One quick shout out, Dan Fuller. You're welcome for putting this together. And thanks for being out there engaging. If you have questions, or if anyone out there while we're live, feel free to post them there as well in the comments, and we'll bring them up to the folks here. But with that, Sean, I'll start with you. And I would love to get your take, just even your initial reaction to that announcement with Amazon flying these drones, at 500 cities doing drone delivery. Obviously, I'm assuming Part 108 and scaling drone operations as organizations is played a role in that. But I'm just kind of curious from the folks that you represent on the energy drone and robotics side of the house, like, what's your take on that and the impacts that may have, positive, negative, whatever the case. I was just kind of curious from the industry.
Sure. So, I mean, if we look at it, we discussed a lot about there was going to be an escalation. In essence, we were going to be going from kind of a quiet sky mode to a lot, much more of a noise floor that was going to be happening across critical infrastructure assets. This was inevitable, even prior to this announcement. So that was discussed quite a bit at our Energy Security Counter UAS forum back in June. So the question becomes really with something like this, which, as you mentioned, David, is huge scale, 500 cities. I know here in Houston, we've had, delivery for a while from Amazon and as well as Walmart and some of the other players. And there's obviously a lot of energy infrastructure here. But at the end of the day, it's just going to escalate is the way we see it. It may accelerate as well some of the needs that we have for multi-layered detection and potentially down the road mitigation that will be part of a counter UAS. So when we look at critical infrastructure, pipelines, transmission lines, substations, these are long linear that cover miles and miles, thousands of miles across, the United States and North America. There's going to be a lot more flights, so whether that's with Part 108, whether that's continued growth and delivery with people like Amazon, we see that it's going to be high traffic. And how are we going to create high traffic corridors that intersect with us? And it's going to make it exponentially harder to isolate and identify those hopefully very few malicious drones from legitimate, delivery traffic. So it's definitely going to make it a lot noisier, but that means the technology is going to have to be brought to the forefront even faster.
Yeah, copy that. That's good. Yeah, Michelle, I mean, you've been tracking this for a long time as well from the industry standpoint. What was your reaction to this?
Well, I think it's great. I mean, I'm so proud of that team and what they've been able to do. It's phenomenal. And they are, as we've seen with other firsts in our industry, they are a target, but yet they continue to do their due diligence, and they are doing fantastically. So I'm really happy for them. I'm happy for the industry. It's not without concern. So we talked a little bit in the green room about the multitude of other mission types that are in this low altitude operating environment. And they continue to present themselves as our non-aviation community starts recognizing the value of drones in the workplace. And between the growing medical delivery sector, which is really, it's really important. We've had this organ theft challenge for years, where transport is disrupted and the content is stolen, put on a black market. It's horrible. This is another mitigation for that. Although we don't typically focus on that, it's really important to us as a culture overall, as a society overall, to make sure that we figure this out and that it works. That's one. And then, as Sean was talking about, construction, massive. There's also automotive, sending parts back and forth, cross-border industrialization. I'm from upstate New York, up on the Canadian border on the east side, just like 50 miles south of Montreal. These people are all family up there. And they are building businesses on either side of the border. And those businesses really want to be able to use to benefit from the drone technology efficiencies, to be able to send, whether it's real-time documents that they don't want to be digital, that they require that hard copy, or contracts or parts or whatever it is. So then we have DoorDash that is now coming into our community with a bang. There's going to be a lot of traffic that is in the low altitude operating environment, that it's really going to be a challenge to be able to distinguish who's who in the zoo. Now, the FAA is still making forward progress. They recognize this. This is not news to anyone. So with the new Discover program that helps law enforcement identify if there's an infraction, and then the Deter program that helps FAA recognize when we're talking the careless or clueless, the smaller infractions, and helping them to address them. We always have to keep in mind FAA is not law enforcement. They are an aviation regulator and air navigation service provider. But all of these things together, we're starting to come together. We know that the technologies are at a mature level, right, in our industry. It's really time that we start figuring out how to mature those business models, and that's what Amazon is doing. They're showing what it looks like to expand their business model into scalability in a meaningful way. And I for one, I'm a fan, and I'm appreciating what they're doing for us.
Yep. One of my personal questions is kind of a phrase that Sean tossed out there, but I may be using an alternate meaning for it, which is noise floor. And even in the announcement of these 500 cities, I watched a quick news video, and the drone in the video was rather loud, I thought. And I was like, dang, well, like, that's going to be interesting. Having hundreds or thousands of these flying overhead. Curious what you've seen so far. Sean, you said there's a lot of that already going on in your city. If you've noticed that, if that's, an issue at all. And then I guess second question is, like, I could imagine infrastructure like radars, other means, whatever it is, to be able to fly higher, enable higher flight, might actually, higher altitudes would help reduce the noise to the impact to the ground, which was just a passing thought I had as you were talking about. I was curious, Sean, what your experience is there.
Personally, I have not noticed it at all, Dave, from my standpoint, versus other types of noise, that you get, with helicopters or planes or what have you. So, just in the low altitude. But I will say that I know there is a Texas-based group that is about noise complaints, because Texas was one of the early proving grounds. Dallas, Fort Worth, College Station, Austin, Houston. There's been a variety of different programs that have been running. And so fairly quickly, you did start to see some people who, got together and have created a lobbying group now that is about two issues, I believe. It's noise, and it's around the civil liberties, as far as, are these taking, are there cameras attached to these, which obviously there are in some cases, obviously for part of their detect and avoid. So it's part of the technology they need to operate safely. But, where are those cameras aimed when they're landing, going into the backyard, to deliver the package? So there are some groups, I guess you'd say it's similar to the groups that have, quickly grown around flock safety, right, around those issues. So I think they're anytime you have a technology, I think Michelle said it well, there's always people, they call them pioneers for a reason. They're out there, right? They're the ones that get arrows slung at them. It's tough. But that's kind of how we build technology out, and the infrastructure and the rules and the accommodations. And over time, they probably, are going to make them quieter. Maybe they'll fly them higher. I don't know. That adds another level of complexity. But yeah, so I do know there are some groups that have some issues with it. But I don't know the details as to how much of a challenge that really is.
Back in the early days, God, I feel so old when I say that, but it's like literally true. Back in the early days, the FAA was looking at what kind of noise threshold levels there should be and what kind of environmental studies would be necessary. And, basically, once you get up above like 100, 150 feet, it's really negligible for these small delivery drones. I'm not sure that they're even maxing out at 400 feet in most areas. I'm sure somebody out there has done that crosswalk between the typical, optimized altitude that these delivery drones are flying, and a little bit higher from a noise saturation perspective. I've not seen that, but I'm sure it's out there. I'd be interested if someone could put that in the comments and we could take a look at that. But so far, I think the visual noise is really what I'm hearing more about as opposed to the audible noise.
Yeah, that kind of brings another question up. I guess, Sean, I'd be interested to hear your perspective, and as well as you, Michelle. But when you're looking at kind of the level of congestion that the airspace potentially will be getting, particularly when you have Amazon, Walmart, and also a lot of these utilities and LNG folks will be using their own drones, how do you foresee like the airspace being managed? Do you think that they'll make a database where we'll have whitelisted drones where Amazon and utilities and all those folks will have to kind of submit and say, hey, here are all our drones, and it'll be kind of shared amongst the community? Or will it be a federal thing? Will there be a federal database that kind of tracks the whitelisted drones, or it'll be some just community by community, people manage it differently? How do you see that taking shape? And also, do you foresee that being a hurdle for widespread adoption with like utilities or these different folks wanting to start using drones more, but not necessarily having a good way of managing the airspace? So I'd be interested to hear your perspectives on that.
From our perspective, we look at it as that there definitely should be a case made for a national standard. I mean, we have, if you look at it from our standpoint, a national whitelist we think is a good idea, but it would have to be done through a very secure, cryptographic authority to fly type broadcast, not like a list of names and addresses. That's not going to help us in real time. But basically, if you do have a framework that says, is this specific drone allowed here, and switch it to, is this drone currently broadcasting a verified authorization token for this specific airspace? That's what we need. We need something that's much more accurate, much more real time on a national level, not, so we're not siloed into local, regional, state. I mean, that's just a patchwork, and our energy assets are cross over all of those. It's very rare that we don't have multiple jurisdictions involved. So for us, we think a national standard makes a lot of sense, as long as it's very safe, meaning it cannot be easily hacked into, and that it can actually broadcast who's supposed to be where. So we think that would be something that would be a benefit to the energy industry for all these different reasons, that you're going to have an increase in drones being flown across of our assets.
Out of curiosity, and you guys probably know more about this again than I do, but isn't Part 108, doesn't, at least like as far as we know, maybe in draft, I don't know if we have the final rule yet. I think we're waiting for that, hopefully sometime in 2026. But didn't it account for between 108 and 2209? I thought there was an accounting for enabling both flight restrictions and the ability for a drone with LANC approvals and a known drone that has a committed path that's going to fly through that restriction, that could happen in tandem or at the same time, where like there was different levels, I think, of restriction, right? Where the kind of softer level would enable a drone that's known, that has a known flight, that has to cut through that airspace to go through. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, we have in practice already when FAA is working TFRs, for example. There's a process, and there's always been a process for any aircraft, whether it is part of the team that's working whatever that event is beneath that TFR, or it's media with authorization to enter that temporary flight restriction area. So there is precedent that the UAS flight restrictions that will come out of, I think, coming out of 2209 will adopt, and it works. So there will be ways for drones to be operating within the area of concern and to operate through the area of concern with appropriate authorizations.
We see, though, within that, agreed, Michelle, in general scope, we see, though, that there's 2 or 3 challenges currently, within 2209 when it comes to energy infrastructure, and that need to be discussed and addressed. And certainly some of these, to your point, David, would correspond to Part 108. There's parts of that don't really meet the needs of the energy sector. And I'll go into all 3 of them briefly. Number one is a threshold problem. So speaking to 2209, there are certain types of energy assets that are massive, like LNG, like liquid petroleum, substations for energy utilities under 500 megawatts. There's certain things that are very much part of the energy infrastructure that are not considered in the threshold. In other words, these are beneath the threshold that have some of the regulations applied. So that's a challenge. So some of these limits, these megawatt limits, barrels per day limits, those are problematic, and we find them to be somewhat arbitrary. Because obviously if you do have a failure or an incident occur at some of these unprotected storage tanks or substations, that can cascade into a grid-wide event. So we think that's an issue that needs to be addressed. Another one is similar to the mandating that operators submit detailed 24-month flight logs and vulnerability assessments. That's creating almost a blueprint if it's ever accessed by a nefarious actor. So we feel like it would make a lot more sense for a self-certification loop that keeps vulnerability assessments in the hands of operators. So we feel like that's another key area. And last is obviously a question within the technology for everybody, not just critical infrastructure, but remote ID, is essential for compliance, but it's self-reported. I mean, the market demand for radar and layered detection is rising because a sophisticated adversary, simply is not going to turn on their remote ID signal, or they're going to spoof. So we have problems there that have to be addressed. And I think that's when I talked earlier about accelerating some of the technology adoption. We believe that's going to be the case in energy. We're going to need all the above. The RF, we're going to need radar, we're going to need cameras, optical, sound. We're going to need all of that in these crowded noise levels in order to make sure that we, noise meaning number of flights, we're going to need to have technology applied to all of that. So it sounds a little bit like a gripe list, but it's just 2 or 3 things as these things are coming about. We've got to keep in check to make sure we're really protecting critical infrastructure top to bottom.
Could there be an argument made as well for potentially restricting flights totally over certain types of, particularly LNG, processing plants, even just the lithium batteries on a delivery drone falling into one of those facilities could be catastrophic. So, is that something that the organization has thought about, like having some more, extreme restrictions? I know, I guess you can only get what you can get, but is there a desire for that if that was available for particularly those sites?
It is a desire, obviously, and it is part of the mix of what is in these proposed rules. But the question becomes, how is that going to be enforced? And then, also, how do you do it in a way that it does not restrict the ability of people who should be able to fly in those areas? So, for every point, yes, it would be great to be able to say, well, these areas are off limits, like an airport is, you can't fly there. But at the same point, with critical infrastructure, I said these are thousands of miles of assets. So you've got some real challenges as far as just putting them all off limits. And we in the energy industry recognize that, and we need to find a way to be compliant, to protect the assets for everyone's sake, but also allow drone activity that is lawful and should be occurring to be able to occur.
Yeah, I agree 100%. If we continue to try and restrict each risk that we can imagine, that whack-a-mole game is just going to get way out of control, and we will start preventing the services that those locations are really in need of, because of our fear of being unable to address the risks that those types of technologies bring. So I think there's a couple of things that are in play. One is electronic conspicuity. So that's not a tool, right? That's an approach, and it's multiple layers. So now we're thinking about what is it going to take for drones to be seen. And we talked about remote identification already, how to identify them, how to track them, and in different ways, whether it's an RF or if they don't have the remote ID on, maybe it's optical, maybe it's an audible, type sensor. All of these layers together give us situational awareness. That's what we really are looking for. And then we need to validate that situational awareness. And we've already been talking about some kind of common database. I worry about that kind of solution because that implies, as with any relational database or clusters, that there is constant updating that has to happen in order to keep it current. And the pace of this industry and how it changes, I have some concerns that kind of approach may not be as suitable as something that is more distributed, in a secure way, obviously, where there is a network of databases. There is a communication layer that enables that secure and instant transmission of validation or intelligence that gets that answer to the end user immediately. I think these things are starting to take shape and will help with the gap that we have, but it's still a work in progress.
I could see, the UTMs of the world that have now kind of transferred over to becoming the next Part 146, ADSPs, automated data service providers. It seems like the protocols that they need to work within to be a Part 146 provider probably starts to lay the ground bed for that, the foundation of that sort of interoperable data sharing of that sort of information, I would think. Wes, I'm kind of curious to get your opinion, from both the Echodyne ground-based DAA standpoint, but also just your exposure to all these other, associated folks that are kind of part of this, right? Different technology groups that are part of AUBSI and other places that you've been. Just like your take on some of this. I saw you nodding a couple times. Electronic conspicuity, layered systems. There was a couple things throughout there. I'd love to get some of your perspectives on this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, as these operations become more complex, so the infrastructure that's detecting, these type of operations that provide that situational awareness in real time. And going back to the Amazon Prime drone delivery, it's something. The first question that came to my mind after congratulating and saying awesome by 100 sites is massive, but how do you enable those operations safely, repeatedly, and at scale? And that's where GBDA technologies and the multiple layers that go into it really help provide that support, because having that detection, that mitigation, or not mitigation, but that detection piece right now is critically important because it's very congested with more of these operations. I was at a summit or a conference last month, and we got to hear from Zipline CEO, and he put out a pretty stark data point that they have more daily operations from their drone deliveries for Zipline than commercial airlines like United Airlines. So it's one of those things where you're seeing, if that's just Zipline, then you add those other players in the mix on top of DFR, on top of public safety, the organ deliveries for healthcare, having that snapshot, making sure that you have these different layered approaches, whether it be electronic conspicuity or the actual GBDA infrastructure to help support that. That's where it's extremely important. That's where the conversations are having. And, that's why, continuing to go to events like Commercial UAV next in a couple of weeks to understand, some of the newer entrants to this space, where they're hearing from, getting those fresh perspectives, continuing the conversation from shows like Exponential, or, there's AVS is having their fall symposium later this year in November, where hopefully we'll have more information on that Part 108, Part 146, Part 2209 to continue those debates on. So that's where my head's at right now, is that safe, repeatable, and scale. And that's one of the reasons I came to Echodyne, is because I believe in that mission and the technology that we're building here to help support that.
On that note, in terms of the commercial UAV event, we'll be there. Echodyne will have a booth set up. Wes and I will be there. So come talk to us. We'd love to get to, connect on what's new, what's coming, how we can support, etc. But Sean, you're also going to be down there. You were sharing some really interesting things, backstage before we started, in terms of just your perspective on, the Energy Coalition, the Energy Drone Robotics Coalition that you support, and then the role that each of these other groups plays. You're a commercial UAV, and you kind of had a spoken wheel thing. Anything you could share to kind of bring insight to the community out there listening in, in terms of where your head's at, I guess, and then what you're looking for early September out there, if people come find you, or if you're connecting with folks out there in Vegas at this commercial UAV event.
Sure, absolutely. Looking forward to going out there. And, we go out basically to take a look at the multi-sector approach from, that's always interesting to us, because we live, every day, 24/7 in the energy market, and we look at things from that lens. And, it's always good to be able to go out to something and look at something that's going to cover multiple sectors, because you can see what's impacting areas that are either adjacent to where we are, things like construction and public safety, or things that are a little further removed, like agriculture or cinematography. So if we were able to look at the different technologies, use cases, best practices, that's always something that we're keen to see, because it's of interest back to our members and community, where it may be able to enable some of the things they want to do for their projects and programs, or we could see things on the horizon when we're looking at big picture. So like Wes was mentioning, when we take a look at some of the proposed rules that we've been discussing, right, there'll be some updates at commercial UAV like they were in May at AUVSI. We get to see some things that are from a broader perspective. And that's always, I think, important for us to be able to kind of get the best information and bring it back. If people want to connect, feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn. I'd love to meet with anyone while we're out there, and look forward to having a good event out in Las Vegas in a couple weeks.
Love it. That's awesome.
Yeah, we'll be in booth 444. So anybody who's on here, I'll be there. David will be wandering around. So encourage anyone who's interested in continuing this conversation, understanding a little bit more about airspace awareness, detecting the void, counter, UAS, BB loss, come by, meet the team. And, for me, this would be my 10th commercial UAV, I think, something like that. Something crazy. Been there since the beginning. And, I always enjoy the conversations with the people and like face-to-face, integrators, technology partners, seeing who's new there, who's missing, but also any of the decision makers who come to Vegas, maybe in a more relaxed environment, to see what they're thinking about, get their thoughts on infrastructure investment, especially from the economic development groups from the state, local, tribal, and even the federal level, if they're going to be there. Just so I can take those as data points, bring them back to my team, share them with my partners, my community, and that way we can all be marching in the same direction.
I love it. And something else, if you guys are looking to come and you haven't bought your ticket yet, since we have a booth, we're able to get you like some sort of a code to get a discount to come, at least for the expo portion of it. So feel free to reach out to us. Now, Michelle, you're going to be the lucky one of the 5 of us on this call that's not going to be in Vegas, but you'll be off in Cancun having a wonderful time out there. I just want to toss it to you also to just kind of get your thoughts on Cancun, and then what you would normally look for, kind of your where your head's at, just relative to commercial UAV, relative to wherever you want to go with it. Just kind of give us a snapshot of the mind of Michelle Duquette these days.
Well, that's frightening in and of itself, right? So I'll offer, same as Wes. I've been going to these conferences for, what are we now, in 2026? So maybe 20 years, maybe a little bit more than that. And obviously the conversation is very different today. And the mission sets, the technologies, the government positionings are all very different today. I learn something new every single time. I can't afford to go to every single conference, but there is a unique value to being in person and being able to capitalize on the energy and the brainstorming that happens and the thought leadership that's shared. There's definitely an advantage to being part of that. For commercial UAV specifically, it's always been a more intimate, smaller venue. That's changed. It's getting bigger, but I remember years past where you had very, very deliberate people on stage talking about like their daily ops, which is not something you get at the bigger conferences like AUVSI. We at AUVSI, we all focus mostly on enabling policy and the security issues and how we open up new markets and the multi-sector of autonomy and how it all comes together. In commercial UAV, we were really focused on, we're doing farming and we have these particular challenges and we want to be able to use the drones to be able to do these things. My crop is rotting because of too much water or unknown infestation or whatever, and it takes so long. And out of that, the sensors start being developed because these folks they're small, they're agile, and they get after it. And that's how we see the proliferation of some of the new tech comes out of these kinds of conversations. And I think it's extremely valuable. I hope everybody that can go to this and other conferences really does make it a priority, because the experience and the networking, those things are not what you can get like this. Right? This is wonderful for us to be able to talk with one another, but it's different when you're in person, and it's different when you have that kind of surrounding and that kind of energy and those curated discussions.
That's awesome. Love that. Actually, you kind of reminded me of it. One more thing, Sean, if you could touch on the construction comment you made earlier that I thought was very interesting, because your focus is, and you're going to this event to see what's new, everything Michelle, kind of tagging off of what Michelle just said. But there's this sort of alternate world of the world of construction and how drones are being used there. And you mentioned something about, exposure to that, learning about that, bringing that back to your coalition. That's energy, utilities, oil and gas, in these locations, they're not construction companies, right? Using, but how do those two worlds? I thought was a very interesting kind of cross-pollination.
Sure. So if you think about it, David, energy market, right? We have fixed assets. Some of these were built many, many decades ago, whether it's a nuclear reactor or a refinery. These things haven't been built in a long time, but they're constantly getting enhanced, expanded. When we see new things being built in the energy infrastructure, like LNG plants, or we're looking at a large build out going on around power generation, in renewables, in natural gas, in order to and transmission, in order to connect to data centers, which obviously is a whole nother large industrial project. We basically are seeing a lot of industrial level construction that's going on, that's either off the back of the energy assets that currently exist, or to expand the energy assets so that they'll be there for industry and consumers. So what we're seeing is a large number of drones and robots and a lot of technology like reality capture, digital twins, that are being used on current assets in energy are now also getting utilized quite a bit in construction, in this industrial level construction, all types of construction, but we obviously focus on heavy industry. So it's an area that's not just adjacent to us, it's now kind of crossing over into between energy and construction at an industrial scale. So it's kind of an exciting area, and there's a lot of lessons learned that we're able to move back and forth. Technologies move back and forth. So whether it's a fixed asset that's already established, or whether it's something that's being constructed or built at a port or at a current facility, that's kind of exciting for us to be able to look at that and expand coverage to be able to help bring those use cases across from construction to energy and vice versa.
Love it. That's awesome. Josh, you want to throw in what's on your mind? And then we'll wrap from there.
Yeah, it's just exciting seeing just a lot of this new technology coming out. I think the one technology I'm most excited for, and I think will be the biggest game changer, is when it's possible, the super heavy lift drones that can carry shipping containers. I know I've been speaking to a lot of ports, and there's just a lot of restrictions on how much access you can get with vehicles or trains or other types of current freight movement. And I just think it'll be really and a real game changer once you can do that, like the mid-mile going from warehouse to warehouse or ship to warehouse. It will be a big game changer. Probably won't happen in the next year or two, but definitely coming down the road. So excited to see just how much this technology is changing. And I'm sure we'll be talking about that at the conference, but also just into the future. So very exciting.
And actually, Josh, that's a good point. And the last thing I'll say that you just sparked in my head is that it is these warehouse, centralized distribution locations that really get unlocked when it comes to radars, when it comes to the more sophisticated layered full stack, layered detection systems that are needed for infrastructure that we talk about. It's those, that are the central hubs that have all the goods, and that maybe drones go there and then wheel and spoke out to the local areas where I've kind of seen more traction as well in the industry, from a radar standpoint versus every radar coverage on every single endpoint, on every single, business, every single home, hundreds of miles, thousands of miles is less realistic. However, when you get to those kind of central, almost to your point there, where all of the goods end up kind of converging and then going out from there, the more we can kind of create efficiencies there and deconflict between all the drones coming in and out and all the hive, as it were, is a pretty interesting, point of focus, to unlock with technology. But anyway, with that said, thank you, each of you, for your time, for joining today. It's always a pleasure to see you, and it's a little family growing here. And always good to see you in person. Michelle, you'll be, again in Cancun having more fun than we are, but so we'll miss you. But we'll see each of your other lovely faces there in Vegas here first couple days of September. And then anyone out there listening, again, feel free to reach out, join, or find these folks on LinkedIn and connect and ask about their services, their coalitions, the different things that they're involved in. Each of them, Michelle, Sean, Josh, Wes, myself. And tune in next time we're live. Actually, next week we'll have a really good one coming up that you're not going to want to miss. We'll announce that soon. All right. Thanks, everybody.